right, I think we can go ahead and get started and people can join us as their evenings free up. So hello everyone and welcome. As you know, since you signed up for this panel, this is our panel on returning to the classroom, the education gap in low income students of color. I'm Christina Pei. I'm Housing Up's Vice President of Philanthropy and Communications. Housing Up provides affordable housing and supportive services to more than 900 formerly homeless and low-income families in the district. So I'm really excited to dive into tonight's conversation. As we all know, students are back in the classroom with several challenges ahead for this school year and some gaps to try and close from last year's virtual learning. Our panelists tonight represent some important voices in education, and together we'll be discussing the current education landscape, challenges faced by at-risk students in the classroom, and the roles that we can all play in improving the learning experience for all DC students. So a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions for our panelists as we proceed this evening, please pop them in the chat feature. We're going to make sure to save some time towards the end of our convo for your questions. Now let's go ahead and get started and introduce our panelists. First up, we have Ashley Jeffrey. Ashley is the Director of Special Projects at Washington Leadership Academy, and her role there includes focusing on COVID preparation and protocol, federal grants, and working with the Board of Directors. Ashley is a former policy analyst for K-12 education at American Progress. And prior to that, she worked on LGBTQ inclusion in healthcare and child welfare policies at the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. She received her bachelor's degree in urban studies with a minor in African and African American studies from Washington University in St. Louis, and holds a master's degree in education policy and management from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Hi, Ashley. Up next, we have Karla Watson. Karla currently serves as the Chief Program Officer for Higher Achievement, a nonprofit dedicating to closing the achievement gap by providing a rigorous after-school learning environment in our underserved communities. Karla began her career as a staff attorney with Legal Services for Children in New York City, where she represented at-risk children in special education matters and disability hearings. Karla joined DC Public Schools as a senior policy associate in 2008. And during her 11-year tenure with DCPS, Karla supported principals, teachers, and other key stakeholders in complying with all federal and state laws, ensuring that DCPS provides a safe, accessible, and fully resourced schools to all of its students. Karla earned her BA from the University of Maryland and her JD from NYU. Welcome, Karla. And then finally, we have Phyllis Jordan. Phyllis sits on Housing Up's Board of Directors and is the educational director at Future Ed, a think tank dedicated to improving education for disadvantaged students. Previously, she held senior roles at Attendance Works and the Hatcher Group, where she worked to improve the policy and practice around school attendance and on a range of early literacy initiatives. Phyllis holds a BA from Sweetbriar College and an MA in journalism from the University of Missouri. Hello, Phyllis. Thank you all for joining us tonight. So we'll dive right in, starting with a broad and big questions, which we can probably focus the entire hour on, but try to be a little brief. So what educational barriers did your organizations or schools see for Black and Brown families before the pandemic, and how has COVID-19 affected those barriers?
Who do you want? Why don't I start and give some
dive in.
Which is to say almost every barrier that there is in education, you have Black and Brown and low-income students are facing it. Literacy rates for third grade reading rates for Black and Brown kids are well below what they are for other students. Attendance rates, chronic absenteeism rates are much higher in the minority communities and among disadvantaged students. Graduation rates of going on to college, rates of kids getting access to and success in advanced placement classes. So all of those were issues, and the pandemic has exacerbated them. The test scores, not surprisingly, have gone down with so many kids in remote learning. But in DC, there was a study done by Empower K-12, which showed that learning, the amount of expected learning actually went up slightly for white students and for non, I'll just call them advantaged student, for students who aren't disadvantaged, whereas for Black kids, for Latino kids, and for low income kids, the amount they should have learned at a certain period was well below where it typically was. Chronic absenteeism, I did a study about looking at 5 districts nationwide. One wasn't DC, but in all of them, the disadvantaged kids were missing multiple more days than they typically miss. And the other students were not having that, the differences weren't as big. So that's just to say, and all these are going to play out. These are leading indicators and going to play out in things like graduation rates, college going rates, that sort of thing.
Right, absolutely. What about you, Karla? What are you all seeing in higher achievement?
So prior to COVID, so higher achievement, we focus on middle grades. We're looking at 5th to 8th graders, and we are providing access to top tier high school placement, so college preparatory high school programs for our youth. So we're looking for youth that are doing fairly well, but don't necessarily have access to how do you navigate the complicated high school placement lottery system here within the district. So that's one of the ways that we kind of manage there, kind of help close that gap. We also use mentors and volunteers as caring adults to kind of help walk our scholars through that process, to also build the social emotional learning skills and things of that nature. So how they're advocating for themselves, how they're making sure that they are showing up and being heard with their voice, how to write their essays for their application. So things of that nature. So we were dealing with a gap that already existed, particularly, for disadvantaged communities or Black and Brown. Specifically for higher achievement, we roughly, I want to say maybe about 79% are Black scholars and about 12% are Latinx. So there was a population that we were dealing with, trying to give them access, trying to give them window and place and support to kind of make it to that next high school level that hopefully they can hold their hand and carry them to timely graduation from high school and post-secondary success. So with that, you can imagine all of the different challenges and barriers there. Just, like I said, navigating the lottery system or the application system or the testing that's required for some of our school systems. What's interesting that even last year during where a lot of the standardized tests, like particularly School Without Walls, had actually stopped doing that required test for you to apply. And we had students that apply, and yet the rate did not go up. The difference as far as the representation of kids in color, particularly in the wards 7 and 8, did not actually go up. I know, I think I read an article where the chancellor was mentioning their concern, they're looking into it, but it's not surprising when you're talking about systems and structures that have these institutional barriers where you are looking for a certain profile of a scholar, where you are, where you have the more advantaged folks. Like 10 years ago, you didn't have over in Ward 3 as many well-to-do folks. They were going to private schools. They weren't going into public school. So now it's becoming a lot more competitive for our kids in other locations of the city to really compete for those seats in those programs that's going to allow them to kind of push forward. So post-COVID, it's during the entire process, you're looking at, I can't believe in a city this size, you're still talking about access to the internet. I'm talking about steady, reliable access. It took a while particularly for DC public schools to start thinking about one-to-one technology, what that meant. And it's not just give a child a laptop and that's going to work. How do you maintain it? How do you travel? How do you protect it? How do you make sure you're not leaving on the bus or whatever the case may be? So there was a lot that we were expecting from our youth very quickly turn around that without having that regular exposure, without having that that fluency about how to use and navigate the system, absolutely. We were trying to fill that gap. So that, and I'm sure I can fill in a bunch, but we can go to Ashley at this point.
I know, very easy to solve issues you and Phyllis have brought up so far. Ashley, do you want to round out the trifecta? Karla was talking about she's preparing the kids to go to high school, and now in your role. So what's going on at Washington Leadership Academy?
Yeah, so we are high school, we serve 9th to 12th, and then some students who may need credit recovery will still work with us. But yeah, so similar to what Phyllis was talking about in terms of gaps, we had, academic gaps that all existed before the pandemic, and the pandemic really exacerbated that. But there's a piece too that Karla brought up around the internet. I mean, like, that's huge, right? So in a remote world where all of your homework, we're tracking absenteeism, we're tracking all of these different factors via, are you logged into the computer? If you can't log into the computer because you don't have internet, or maybe because there are gaps in internet because of maybe you have access to it, but like the bill wasn't paid this month or what have you, right? And so we're lucky enough that we have the resources to be able to help families with that. So like literally giving them Wi-Fi hotspots through our own budget. So this is pre a lot of the measures that Comcast came out with or different companies came out with. So being able to have those resources is really helpful. But then there's the other piece around like the internet literacy or media literacy to a certain extent. So that students who are the newer kids, right? So the gap of once the year shifted over and now we had new ninth grade and new 10th grade, right? Like, are they prepared to deal with the type of school that we have? And we're a technology focused school, or ideally we're supposed to be. So are you getting the same tricks and trades and experience without having a teacher help coach you through that? Because our 12th graders are used to 3 years worth of doing something a certain type of way, or 4 years worth of that. But our 9th graders and 10th graders, to a certain extent, had some gaps there, right? And so part of it too is trying to track down all of these different students to say, did you log into class today? And then dealing with how teachers were dealing with fatigue, and then dealing with how all of these other barriers that are coming up that had nothing to do with school at all, right? It had to do with the car bill, or car bill not being paid, or like electricity having an issue, right? All of these other factors that impact the students day to day. And so besides the academic piece too, I mean, we saw that all of those factors really played a role as well. So, I mean, I can pause right there because I think we've said a lot of it, but.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to kind of that competing priorities, especially with high school kids. So we'll get to that in a minute. Phyllis, especially in your role as policy expert, I am not an education policy expert. So we tried, looking through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan and trying to figure out exactly what does all this funding mean, right? The numbers are huge. It sounds so great. What does all of this funding actually mean for K through 12 education for DC schools?
Well, I'll say before I was a policy expert, I was a journalist. And about a year ago, well, more than a year ago, right after the CARES Act passed in March, my boss said, why don't you write a little blog post about what's in the CARES Act for education? So I did. And then there kept being more bills. There were all these bills that didn't go anywhere, but I kept tracking them. And then somehow Google put that piece on, if you Googled what's going on for K-12 schools and and congressional COVID funding, that piece came up, and now 300,000 people have read that piece. I keep updating it all the time. Anyway, so
SEO at work, yes.
So being a policy expert is really the same thing as being a journalist. But I will say that there are three bills have passed for COVID relief funding, and collectively there's $190 billion in the budget for K-12 schools. And the money flows through what's called the Title I formula, which supports schools with concentrated poverty, so that this money is going to the highest need schools, or theoretically it is. When I took a look at what DC's getting from the 3 different packages, DC gets $600 million, which they can spend. And the ways they can spend it are quite broad. Not just DC, but everybody has very broad allowable uses for this money. I mean, there's some things you can't do, like put it in your rainy day fund. But pretty much you could build a school if you wanted to. Don't do that. But there's a lot you can do. Construction, you can rehab your HVAC system. You can hire tutors, you can hire psychologists. In terms of, what DC did with the first wave, which was called the CARES Act, that was passed in March 2020. DC did what a lot of school districts did, or state school district, whatever DC is, they spent a lot of their money on software, hardware, and Wi-Fi, what you need for remote learning. They also spent a lot on getting schools ready for kids again, putting plexiglass up or doing the things you needed to do to keep kids safe at school. And then, the second wave came last December, and they again used a lot of that for safe reopening, but they also started putting money into mental health. There was a real big recognition that there was a lot of trauma associated with the pandemic. There was isolation, kids not seeing other kids. There was loss, and people lost parents. They lost, relatives. There was hunger. There were a lot of issues that were making kids anxious, making kids depressed. Teachers too, staff members had a lot of things. So all three of the bills that passed Congress specifically mentioned student mental health. And in the second wave of spending, DC has started to spend money on that. Now they've got their third wave of spending, which is the American Rescue Plan, which is the biggest. It's $386 million. And they're just, they've submitted a plan of how they're going to spend it. And it involves tutoring. It involves after school programs. It involves, absenteeism initiatives, all the things that you really are going to need to do to try to turn around the academic losses and the help kids recover socially and emotionally. And I think a big emphasis for school districts too is working on discipline. School district, one thing I didn't mention earlier, but there's these huge disparities in how Black and brown kids are disciplined, and how often they're suspended or expelled. Now you've got a bunch of kids coming back to school, and they haven't been in school for a year, and they're anxious and they're depressed and they're just plain rambunctious, and a lot of school districts are spending money on training teachers on the kind of practices that can calm things down versus just pushing kids out of the classroom.
De-escalation, very important. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. That's actually much more helpful summation than anything I've read online. So well done on that article. Moving, Ashley, I'd say we would come back to kind of talking about high school students in particular, and kind of their focus kind of being pulled all over. A big part of the high school curriculum is preparing students for college and higher education, but then we've seen that the pandemic has forced a lot of high school students, especially brown and Black students, to kind of take up additional responsibilities for the family, providing for, caring for. So what pandemic related challenges have you seen as you kind of help high school students get back into this, okay, we can maybe focus on school, but it's not like the pandemic is over, right? So what does that look like?
Yeah, so our school is like 98% or 99% Black and brown. And so a lot of the issues that we discussed already, like we've seen present just live, because I think there's definitely the disconnect of like, I know you're going through something, but it's through a screen and trying to reach out to you. And then there's the live, like, this is what it looks like. So like we have a lot of kids who are rambunctious. We have a lot of kids who are just trying to understand how to deal with being in a space that they were used to being in, that didn't require masks, didn't require a certain level of distance, didn't have these very stringent approaches of like, please no touching, don't share food, don't socialize in the ways that you're used to. But particularly for a lot of our students during the pandemic, different students had to work, right? They had to provide for their families. When we definitely had students who had to live with different family members, or different students who are MKV status, so McKinney-Vento experiencing homelessness. They had to live with different family members, but obviously it's tricky to live with different family members while COVID is happening, right? So right. It's an unsafe environment, and yet they just had to deal with it, right? There were definitely some students too who had to deal with the living guidelines in the shelters. So the parents can't leave the students in the shelter without being present, and you know, some folks have to do what they
They
had
go
to
to
do,
work
and
and yeah.
they have to go to
Mhm.
work. Yeah. And so it's like, you know, how does that work? And particularly if we're talking about race equity, or from a race equity lens, what does it look like for who has to be the frontline worker, who has to be the what do they call them? Oh, essential workers, right?
Mhm.
That we didn't very treat as if they were essential, right? But what does that makeup look like? And which students does that largely affect? And we know it's Black and Brown students. So
Yeah.
when we think about these rippling effects, we're starting to see it now with our kids. I mean, like we just did our MAP testing, and they're not, the scores are less, but not in the gaps that we thought that they would look like.
Mm.
But I mean, there's a lot of learning loss. There's a lot of, which I think is a misnomer, to be fair, but there are lots of things that our students need to catch up on. And particularly because most of our population is Black and Brown. What I'm really starting to see too is a difference between the vaccinated and unvaccinated students. And so I think that is a huge equity issue that we are now seeing start to burgeon, and particularly thinking about what are the demographics of people who are vaccinated versus people who aren't, and then what does that mean when COVID is ravaging our community? I mean, we've had
Yeah.
series of cases, right? Who does that look like? Who's it affecting? And then who's pushed into quarantine? And then, okay, good luck, you know, as you're
Right.
going out for 5, 10, 15 days because maybe you couldn't get a test, or parent couldn't get off work to get you someplace. I mean, now we have testing at school, but you didn't have a way to get up here. So yeah, so those are some of the things that we're noticing, which, you know, some of the things, the big things, but yeah.
Can I ask a question, Ashley? Can you provide the vaccines at school? Is that a thing you can do? I just don't know what's possible in the district.
Yeah, so we can host a vaccine clinic. Part of my efforts have been to really encourage folks to understand the vaccine is safe. I mean, we've tested a bunch of students who are like, how do I do this? I've never tested before. I don't know anyone that's tested before. And that to me is kind of like, it's been a year and a half,
Yeah.
like
Wow.
2 years, like, wow. We do not directly offer vaccination, but through OSSI, schools can partner with Shield T3. So they do a saliva-based testing. And that has been extremely helpful to cut down our quarantine times, because our
Mhm.
turnaround time for tests is 24 hours. But if you go to your local fire station, we've seen up to 7 days worth of
Yep.
delays in testing. So yeah.
Interesting. So do you know, like offhand, like what's the vaccination rate for students currently?
Yeah, so that's part of the issue, right? Is that a lot of folks are not very responsive when we ask about that. I did a light survey just to call a few parents and say, like, if we offer these incentives, or if we held this town hall, or if we did this thing, what do you think? And they're like, oh, that sounds great for everybody else, but not for me. My kid's never taken the shot. And over time, that's kind of like dissipated. But right now, the data that we have is for like less than half of the families, and it's like a 55-45 split. I don't think that's an accurate representation, because when we do have a case and I have to call people and I'm asking, are you vaxxed or not? A majority of those answers are no. So
Right. And it
yeah,
doesn't match up with DC's general vaccination rates, specifically in like Ward 7 and 8. So
exactly.
yeah. Oh boy. All right, Karla, you're up. So, you know, higher achievement, we know, works with middle school years. And I feel like we see a lot of focus on early education, you know, kindergarten, elementary school, and we see a lot of focus, understandably, on high schoolers. And I feel like middle schoolers often kind of get lost in that gap. So, you know, what does higher achievement do to help students kind of succeed?
Yeah, so that is our major focus. It's what's our little saying? We're like the last best chance, because when they talk about the development of kids, like so much happens in those early years, and then the next big batch is those middle school years, and we really do not. They're kind of glossed over in a lot of in the public education kind of setting. So a lot of focus. We've been doing a lot more intentionality with embedding SEL, social emotional learning, into all the aspects of what we do. So as a part of our mentoring, as a part of, like, we have curriculum, high school readiness curriculum within our mentoring program, where we are starting with relationship building. We are starting with whether it's a mood meter or something that you are allowing kids to get acclimated, get ready, get to trust, and be able to speak to the other adults and folks in there. We're doing optimistic closes as a part of our program. So we're building it in a lot more intentionally, understanding, you know, just what we talked about, what Ashley had talked about with the trauma and the grief, as well as we were talking about high school folks in the care that they have to do at home with their parents being the essential workers. It's the exact same thing with the middle schoolers, as young as the fifth graders as well, caring for elderly parents and things like that. So for us, we're doing a lot of the that emotional support, that kind of building the skills. And then this year, actually, as we've done, we pride ourselves as an academic enrichment at a school time program. So it's not just you're just going to hang out and play or just go to the movies with your mentor, but really kind of focus on homework help. We try to be, we work with the families, work with the schools, to trying to have these quarterly meetings that kind of coincide with report cards, that we are collecting grades, that we are looking at it, we're looking at their attendance. But this year and into next year, we've actually had a huge investment in literacy tutoring. So that's been the big piece, looking at the high doses tutoring. What can we do? And looking at how we're set up as at a school program and having that ability to, what we noticed over the last year is that the kids that have the asynchronous learning, you can't pause and ask the teacher, slow down, especially when you have a large group of kids. We have that ability, having smaller group sizes. We are staffing ourselves in a way that there's a 4-to-1 ratio for these small groups and focus on literacy. We've purchased the Achieve 3000 software on literacy to help kids. You know, it's measuring their Lexile levels. It's it gives us like direction, so it's easy to have a volunteer, another adult and mentor kind of come in and step in without having to be a formal teacher or having to be, you know, having that education, but to be able to guide them through differentiated texts that's based on their Lexile levels, that's giving them questions and prompts, and actually just completely flows into what we were doing already. But again, doing it in these smaller groups with the kids based on their grade levels, based on their Lexile levels, to really give them that additional time and attention. That was definitely one of the things we heard during the virtual year, just being able to pause with the kids. So we did it virtual, go out in a breakout room and let me work on this problem with you. Let me go through this math, and really connecting and giving them the chance that we're listening, we're helping, or even helping them to speak to their classroom teacher about, we're just not getting this, or this is what the struggle is. So we wanted to beef that up over the next couple of years, just looking at what we've seen with the interrupted learning with the virtual piece, and to be able to kind of help rebuild some of those skills and kind of accelerate the literacy growth.
That's great. A quick question for you. Did you see any, you know, I know we're talking about, you know, kids have so much going on. Did you see any drop off in terms of, I'm assuming sometimes kids, you know, are with you for a couple of years, at least, maybe sometimes all 3. Did you see any drop off in kids just maybe not having that kind of capacity to do something else on top of it?
Huge. Yeah, huge drop off. And for many different reasons. And on one hand, you had a group of scholars that use it for that connection. Like we would have like core programming, but then they would have just sessions that folks are just getting online for that socialization, just for, you know, some of that games and those things they weren't doing when they were in quarantine. And then on the flip side, I know this happened when we switched in the springtime of 2020, when we just thought that everything that we did in person, we could just do it online. So the schools are having a full day of screen time. So we went from too much screen time for kids to be online all day right now, and then to get them to log on after with an after school program back in front of a screen. You see it wearing down them, it's weighing down on the parents, the families. It's a lot. It was definitely a lot. I know that we tried to take the opportunity when the vaccine came out about having outdoor space and going into parks and trying to allow that, you know, from the screen that's happening here. So definitely a huge drop off.
Yeah, I was wondering because, you know, we do a tutoring program at Housing Up we've done that for a while after school, of course, and it was definitely a dilemma switching that to virtual, and just making sure that kids can stay engaged when there's so much, it's all screens, like there's too many screens. So yeah, I was just wondering what that looked like. And I know, Phyllis, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, just pinging off what you said, for kids who are insecure housing, this is just compounded because the issues that Karla and Ashley were talking about internet access. If you're not sure where you're living, if you're going from sofa to sofa, or staying in a shelter, you're not sure you're going to have the Wi-Fi. You're sometimes out of position. When school reopens, you're out of position to go to school and you're missing your school. And so many kids were uprooted from where they were. Some kids left the city, but they were still connected to the school. And there were so many kids who sort of went missing, and a lot of that was housing insecurity. So programs like Housing Up that can provide a safe and stable place to live can really make a difference in education.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of that, I know you mentioned some things that DC was focusing on spending the new money for, the latest round of federal funding. Is there anything earmarked like to target those kids? And is there any specific types of programs that can help locate, find, re-engage?
Yeah, well, first, the American Rescue Plan had, aside from the main money for K-12 schools, which is called ESSER, which is, you don't need to know what the acronym means, but take my word for it. But there was another $800 million nationwide for homeless kids, and DC gets 2.5 million out of that.
Okay.
So that can be used to support homeless children. In addition, some of the money that they're planning to spend in the next wave of funding is for re-engaging families. There's several strategies. They already use a lot of these strategies like home visiting. They can do that in person or virtually, depending on the comfort level of the parents, but that's a good way to reconnect with the family and see, what's going on with that family. And in a non-confrontational way, you get to know the parents, you get to see what the situation is, what the housing situation is. There's money that goes to the highest need schools for these sort of community collaboratives. I think they call it Connected Schools in DC. And they sort of have a coordinator who brings social services into the schools. I mean, I'm a big fan of having more counselors and more mental health professionals in schools, but this money only lasts like 3 years. So if you hire a bunch of people this year, you're going to have to do something with them in 3 years. So I think a better strategy, or a more sustainable strategy, is to bring in community resources, connect with mental health agencies and mental health nonprofits, bring those folks into the school. If you need a surge of support right now, you've got those people now. So there is a big emphasis on trying to deal with the mental health issues that kids are facing. So
yeah,
I'm not sure. I'm going to look see. I took some notes, but I'm not quite sure what they're doing with those. I did write down they have as I said, every state has to submit a plan to the federal government before they get their full American Rescue Plan money. And in DC's, they said they are going to have added support for the homeless, but I can't tell you what that is. So
yeah, I want to show having higher achievement. We are based in a few different schools, from charter, mostly DC public schools, and then we're in Virginia and parts of Maryland, things of that nature. It was I would say frustrating to try and figure out what schools. So a lot of schools did not know how much money they were getting. They were asked to develop plans without a budget. They were asked to think about different ideas, but how that actually manifests, or how we thought about how do we determine what's the long term. So we weren't pulling out brand new folks. Like we weren't thinking. I think that one of the stresses was we weren't thinking about the expanded educational landscape. who are these other folks, whether it's the out of school time or the other mental health folks or the Department of Parks and Recreations, how are we working together? And in Boulder Lake, we're already set up in a way to deal with some of this. Like, again, all these barriers aren't new, they've been exacerbated, but they've been there. And so we have organizations and pieces that they have a little piece of it, but a lot of what we saw, at least what I saw here in DC and some similar districts, is that the money was going to the district and to the schools, but they had very limited ability to then kind of pull in and kind of expand or make more. Even our in our connected schools are like folks are like, we'd love you to be in here, but we don't really have like the extra money to kind of expand, but just not fully. The implementation wasn't happening on the ground level like so many other grants and awards, and especially
Right.
the Title I funds that we're talking about. Yeah.
So I think you and Phyllis brought up really good points that kind of segue into our last plan question. I know we've gotten a lot of really good questions from the audience so far, so I'll make sure to save some time for that. But this is a problem that's so large, right? It's going to take a lot of different community resources, community support. It's going to take all of us working from different pieces of the puzzle to support our kids. So how can the DC community support families, kids, educators as they undergo another major transition time? We've already seen kind of shifts in vaccination policy for teachers already in the past couple of weeks since school started. And we anticipate, obviously, things kind of ever fluid and ever changes. So, from each of your perspectives, what can we all do to support, the work that you do, the work that our kids are trying to do?
Yeah, I can start. I think a lot of things come to mind because, like, as we've been talking about, I mean, some of these things are like a funding issue, but at WLA, funding is not really our issue. And in particular, consider the ESSER funds, particularly considering CARES Act funds, like we have a lot of money, but some of these issues they're bigger than money, right? So just to keep that in mind, I think part of what would be helpful too is part of what we see in the charter landscape is that as DCPS does, then we get to do, but charters, sometimes it feels like we're just kind of like the step sibling. And if DCPS decides to implement a rule, then okay, cool, we can do it. So for example, like staff vaccine mandates, right? That just came out yesterday, probably because once DCPS opened, they realized how serious of an issue this was. But before, everyone was saying this is going to be a serious issue, right? So sometimes I think it's a bit frustrating that it takes time to do versus seeing or having the foresight. But part of that too, I think what could be helpful is just being able to talk more across schools and talk more across different industries. I think folks just have different ideas and that's helpful. But as y'all know, if you're working in a school, every day is go. I just have time for lunch maybe, and then focusing on what's right in front of me. So being able to have folks kind of put out more ideas and reaching out to schools to kind of like bring things to us would be really helpful for us because we're trying, but there's so many other things that we're trying to deal with too. It's becoming a little bit difficult. But I think that, and then also I think data is very helpful. It helps me to be able to go to our families and say, these are the rates of COVID in DC. These are the rates of vaccination among Black and Brown students. This is what it looks like in Ward 7 and 8. This is what it looks like in Northwest. Like, do you see the difference here? Do you understand, and like that has been helpful. So, I mean, which I think DC already does a great job of, but in terms of some of these other issues, just basically making the data more known and just talking more about these numbers and allowing me to have a better ability to translate that to our families, because I mean, parents aren't necessarily going on to coronavirus.dc.gov to see what what everything looks like or to find out more about MKV status. So there's that. And then the last thing too is I was talking to our school social worker to prep for this panel. And one of the things that she talked about was like how the MKV status of students is probably way higher than we actually know. And that folks actually know because they might not think of themselves as experiencing homelessness because they're like, oh, I'm living with my cousin, or I'm living, this is stable, like this is family. So not necessarily taking advantage of the resources that are there. So being able, and I'm sure resources like this exist, I don't want to say that they don't, but being able to more easily have that conversation to say like, hey, like homelessness doesn't mean shelter only, or doesn't mean on the street, right? There are different
Especially for
gradients.
families. Yeah,
especially for families, right? There are gradients of this. And I mean, there's stigma attached to that, but part of it too is like, there are resources that it seems like you need. If you tell us about what's going on, we can get you those things. But without that, you know, there are certain barriers to get that. So yeah, I know that was like a lot, but.
No, that's great.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of that, because immediately what came to mind was communication. Like, there's so many folks doing little things in silos that, as much as we are sharing what's available, those resources are huge. And I agree with Ashley, there's a lot of money in there. Like, Phyllis talked about how many billions of dollars that is in the system, but it's about how does it get to the right folks? How does it get to those initiatives and ideas, the folks on the ground, the teachers, the social workers that are working directly with the families, so they can actually make change, to actually provide services, direct services for the students. And that's where I think there's a lot of gaps. So a district-wide plan doesn't, if you don't have that basis of the plan of how each school is implementing it, that rolls up, then it doesn't go the other way around. So that, I think we're starting in the wrong place. And again, like, we have experts, we have folks here on this call in the audience that are doing this work and coming to like, what works best in this community? Where do we see the most need? How do we concentrate? How do we then also communicate when I have a family that's suffering, they don't have access to a Wi-Fi? How are we doing that? Or things of that nature. A lot rests on the schools, and where the district as a whole does not always empower the schools. And when I mean schools, I mean like the classroom teacher. Like, that is who folks know, particularly with the younger grades. Like, Ms. Johnson's going to try to figure out what's going on. She's going to run and talk to the principal, but there's only so much. So as we are communicating more within the city, if we are sharing resources, are we giving referrals? I mean, right now we're looking for kids with higher achievements. I mean, that high doses tutoring is free tutoring. It's free tutoring for your kids. It's individualized attention. Like, that should be something that's generating buzz when you're talking about this gap. So how are we communicating that and making sure that the resources are getting to the kids that need it?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And as Karla said, and Ashley too, it's going to be different. What schools need and how people can contribute to it is going to be different school by school. So if you want to do that, you ought to ask your local school or your charter school or wherever, you know, what can I do to help? And it seems like in some places tutoring is a way to help. And sort of a cousin to tutoring is what's known as mentoring, where you're not necessarily talking academics, but you're connecting to the kid. A lot of times students will attend school more, they'll be more engaged in school if they feel like somebody at school cares that they are going to show up. And so a mentor can help with that. One thing I've read a lot, my kids are out of elementary and high school, thank God, is that parents, for the first time, a lot of them saw what was going on in the classroom, because suddenly they were seeing it through the computer screen, and they became more engaged in it. I don't know if you can hear my dogs are barking downstairs, but sorry about that. You know, to the extent that schools can build on that and find a way to keep parents engaged and help parents become like almost co-teachers, and the way you're saying about communication, you know, keeping up with the parents and making sure they're, you know, I don't know if you all know Stanton Elementary School that's in DC. They've been for years been doing this very intentional sort of connection to parents, where they're telling parents what they need to do to help their kids at home. And to the extent that that can be a silver lining of this pandemic, that parents got more engaged in what their kids were doing, then that would be terrific.
Yeah, absolutely. Very helpful suggestions. And we'll definitely follow up, kind of summarize all of these things in one place for all the attendees. But I do have a couple of questions. So a question for Phyllis, are the funds allocated to DCPS getting to schools in a timely manner? And how fast can the funds be spent?
Yeah, and as I was saying, I was thinking as Karla was speaking, and Ashley, that 600 million is for the state of DC. So about half of that will go to DCPS, and probably half will go to charter schools, and it goes to the local education agency. So it would go to KIP, which has several schools, and would go to Washington Leadership Academy. It goes to different, but there's the biggest chunk goes to DCPS. In terms of time and matter, the money has gotten to schools. The money lasts for 3 years, so it hasn't all gotten to schools. But I think it will depend on what school you talk to. I was talking to a woman out in DC who said her school board was telling her school they couldn't have any of the COVID money because they already have some other 21st century federal grant. I'm like, no, that's not the way it's supposed to work. But so I would say I don't know school by school, but a big chunk of the money, the first 2 waves of the money are at the schools. The final wave is coming, and it's going to last for a couple of years.
Yeah, Phyllis, so I did hear something similar. So some of the grants they're incorporating, so that money went to some of the grants, so to kind of build on what the 21st century was doing, that and like Learn 24 and some other pieces. So OSSI had gotten some of that money and just built it into that. So that is right. And that they do have very strict, you have this grant, so you can't double on top, and you have to make sure it's these kids over here. And that I know that was something that my grants team has been navigating, that has been a little bit complicated because it's not the same what you're getting here. Each grant is offering something different.
And this woman was saying, well, the grant is mostly run by the outside people. We want the money. We want to control the money ourselves. I'm like, well, it seems like there's a lot of issues that
So in short, yes, with an asterisk, money is getting to schools. Yeah, that sounds about.
Not everybody
sounds about right.
Satisfied.
Yes, definitely.
And there is some concern that I haven't heard this as much from DC, but that people are just trying to come up with things to spend it on, and not thinking long term or in a systematic way what it needs to be done. In Florida, the governor said, "I'm going to give every teacher $1,000 bonus." The education department said, "No, that's not what this is for." If you wanted to give bonuses in areas where there are teacher shortages or in teachers in high need schools, that's okay, but don't just give your money away to teachers because you feel like it. So, there's some concern that people are just, using it, not giving a lot of thought to how they're going to spend it. So hopefully they will spend it wisely and sustainably.
Let's hope. Yeah. Ashley, a question for you. Will you be requiring COVID vaccine for attendance going forward? Like, is that a plan at any point for the school year? And if not, what led you to that decision?
So we could have, I'm gonna split it into teachers and students. I'm sure you meant students, but just to clarify. So for staff, we could have mandated it beforehand. We only have a handful of staff who are pretty much actively holding out that they don't want to get vaccinated. And then obviously the news from yesterday shifts that. But we didn't mandate it because we wanted to use positive incentives first. And so that was a similar approach that we had with our students was, I know DC was holding the DC free shot giveaway. They've been doing that since the summertime, right? So if you're a student who's getting a shot for the first time, you're eligible to get AirPods, a $51 Visa gift card. If you're an adult bringing a child to get their vaccine for the first time, you're also eligible to get the gift card, right? But I know that some of those efforts have fallen flat. So, I think at one point when they upped it to having like a $25,000 college scholarship raffle giveaway. And I think at that point they had done 140 students. So which seems kind of wild because I'm like, people are thinking about college, but it wasn't particularly effective. So in our own right, our positive incentives seem to be effective, but for students, as far as I know, we can't mandate it. And even if we could, it's such a delicate balance. And it's harder to do too, because we aren't able to have the in-person conversations with families in the same way. So when we hold our back to school events, they were virtual, right? We tried to do one in person and then a water outage happened, which was just like a freak of nature thing. But even in general, we could only have so many families in person. So you don't really get that same hi, I'm Miss Jeffrey. Like, you can ask me questions, and like
Right.
I can respond to your different concerns and your fears and have empathy within that. Through a screen is hard. Through emails is even harder. So like for students, we haven't mandated it. I don't believe we can too, but it, yeah, it's much easier when the mayor says to do something. Just because I'm still expecting parent pushback to happen. We haven't sent out our email yet. I will after this call, but like,
Yeah.
you know, if you're a student athlete, you have to get vaccinated after November 1st. So, you know, parents can yell, but like
Right.
part of what we say in this email is like, we really believe that this is the best public health decision going forward. So.
Makes sense. Karla, a question for you. So I think you mentioned earlier that you're kind of looking for scholars in your programs. What are you doing to kind of increase that enrollment?
So a lot of it, we've been working closer with our host sites or our schools. So we have a couple of new ones this year. So we just entered into a new partnership with KIPP. So we're at KIPP AIM for this year coming. So a lot, especially when it's a new or organization that somebody doesn't know or a family doesn't know, having a teacher, having a principal. So we want to engage the school folks to be like, hey, there's this partner here, this organization. We think it's really good for your child, for your student, sibling, for your cousin, things of that nature to kind of expand and get the word out. So there's flyers and things, but a lot of it is this word of mouth kind of set up. We're about eight centers within DC proper. So it's kind of working with our partners there. Again, their plans there. I see a lot of opportunity and having worked with DC public schools and knowing, you know, the beast that was enrollment, the beast and all those other things, it does require a different skill, a different kind of, you know, mindset and resources to go out and recruit in that manner. But that is something that we were thinking about as an organization, how to invest to get more folks. And that means investing more in the community and where we are.
Right.
So within those schools and within the community. So it's even just being public, like you're trying to get lime green t-shirts, you know, City Year, everybody knows City Year. They got the red shirts. You see them all over. Higher achievement, we've been around since 1975. You don't really know. So there's a push to do like the lime green and things like that. So folks are familiar. Oh yeah, I know them. I see them. I know what's going on. So again, that communication. So if they ask a question, someone walks in the building, who's that? That's higher achievement. This is what we do. Here's the link. Trying to get up with the, I guess, the social media and all. Yeah, I'm dating myself ridiculously, and QAR codes and things that people can just scan and get on the application. So we're moving in that direction. But yeah, if we can send out information, my email, if folks have questions about higher achievement.
Absolutely. We'll do
Please
that.
do, yeah.
As a wrap up. Two more questions that were perfect timing here. I'm going to kind of summarize this question, I think, a little bit. So we have someone who works with Saga Education, which seems like a program that does a lot of addresses algebra and geometry for 9th and 10th graders who attend schools. They do serve more than 90% Black or Brown students and do free lunch qualification. And so she's noticed that a very few number of Black women are actually serving as the tutors for the program, kind of maybe due to the pay or just kind of a lack of knowledge that this program exists. I think it's maybe similar to an AmeriCorps servicier. And there's just not a lot of Black women actually serving, you know, on the actual end user side. So are there any conversations about this in the landscape and strategies to address to get more Black and Brown folks kind of mentoring and teaching and helping Black and Brown students? Because I think we see that in a lot of different education programs. It's a lot of, you know, white kids who maybe have the resources and the privilege to take a smaller pay and be in those, you know, underserved communities as teachers and things like that. So have you all noticed any conversations around that or ways to kind of increase?
Yeah, so at Higher Achievement, we've embarked on a diversity, equity, inclusion kind of initiative where we recognize certain aspects of programming. So a lot of our mentors we do have in certain areas, a lot of our mentors are more advantaged, white, and not reflective of the Black and Brown scholars that they are serving. And some of the strategies, like it's the intentionality about where are we looking for mentors, and not necessarily our corporate partners or donors and things. So we do have some relationships with corporations that do donations, but then also going to, again, focus on that community. Who else is out there? What are those smaller groups? So we might not be a large organization that has 20 mentors they can provide, but 2 here or 5 here. And also one of the other good things with came out of COVID is that flexibility with being virtual. So folks being able to connect in a different manner with scholars. So there's a lot more flexibility in the schedule. Like how many of us are we done with our 9 to 5 by 5? Are we really done by 9 to 5 by 5 to get and be able to mentor what you're thinking about during the school week? So being flexible about what the different jobs and responsibilities and the areas in which we recruit. But I think that person is absolutely right. You have to be really intentional about how are we making it easier and more visible for our persons of color, our adults, our professionals to actually partake and volunteer their services, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last question for the night, everything we've been talking about tonight is just a long standing inequalities in this country due to redlining and laws targeting Black and Brown communities. Is there space for language in the educational landscape to begin to reshape policy itself? Or is that work already starting to be done or already?
I don't know that you could use your education COVID relief funding for that, though the COVID relief funding does have an emphasis on equity. There's actually a provision called maintenance of equity where you're supposed to make sure that the high need schools are getting a lot of support. But I don't know that there's any way to use it to change policy or to advocate for policy change. But I'd be interested to hear if anybody's going to try.
I think there are ways when we talk about like the implementation, like when we talked about not having a district-wide plan, but looking for solutions and long-term solutions from the school themselves, because those are the folks that are more closely familiar with the community and the needs. And they also think about who are the other folks. When Phyllis, and you did attendance work, you know that it is not just the school folks or the social workers calling, where's your child? It is the corner store owner over there, or it's, the neighborhood watch folks. It's everybody together as trying to figure out where are the spaces that we can support each other as a community. And I think you can, if you are investing in those schools and invest in that community, you can empower that community to take care of their own. So whether it's through those additional where the connected schools that we're really building out, here's the housing assistance for a family, here's really the homelessness assistance. There's some work to be done there in all of our schools about what we're doing with that. There's work to be done just in the city level about how we're managing that. Even when we talk about transportation of kids and getting them to that area and space of where they can have quiet time, where they can learn, whether it's virtually or things of that nature. So I think there are creative ways. Like Ashley said, there's so much money that's floating around. It's when I think sometimes it's when the people that are implementing it aren't able to direct how you're kind of managing that it gets lost and wasted. And this is coming from someone who used to direct all their money on time.
Well, thank you for that, Karla. I think we've reached the end of our evening. Any panelists, any other last words before we wrap things up for the night?
Thank you, Christina, for hosting us.
Of course. Thank you all for joining us. And attendees, thank you for joining us, spending an hour of your evening on another screen. We appreciate it. Stay tuned. We'll be sending an email tomorrow with everyone's contact information and follow up and ways to kind of keep this conversation going, because this is not going to be a one-off thing. We'll probably do a follow-up in a couple of months just to see how everyone's doing with school officially underway. So thank you all again, and everyone have a great evening.